It was a quiet Tuesday evening when a group of rough-looking bikers walked into a small-town diner, their leather jackets emblazoned with patches and their loud voices already turning heads. They didn't expect to cross paths with a teenage kid who looked like he didn't belong, someone they thought they could push around. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, and by the end of the night, that kid would turn their world upside down in a way they'd never forget. The diner was a cozy spot on the edge of town, the kind of place where locals gathered for coffee and pie, and strangers passing through could grab a burger without much fuss. That night, the place was half full, with a few regulars sipping coffee at the counter and a couple of truckers eating in a booth. Among them was Jamal, a 17-year-old high school senior who had stopped by after a long day at school. He was sitting alone at a small table near the window, his backpack slung over the back of his chair, a plate of fries and a soda in front of him. Jamal was a regular here, known to the staff as a polite kid who always tipped well and never caused trouble. But to the group of bikers who walked in that evening, he was just a target. The bikers, 4 of them, all in their late 20s or early 30s, strode in like they owned the place. Their leader, a burly guy with a shaved head and a skull tattoo on his neck, scanned the room with a smirk. His name was Mitch, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing people were intimidated by him. His buddies, Jake, a lanky guy with a scruffy beard, Carl, stocky with a chipped front tooth, and Derek, the quiet one with a scar across his cheek, followed close behind, their boots thudding against the linoleum floor. They slid into a booth a few tables away from Jamal, their conversation loud and peppered with crude jokes. Jamal didn't pay them much attention at first. He was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages from his friends and occasionally glancing at a textbook he'd pulled out of his backpack. He was a straight-A student, captain of the school's debate team, and had a knack for staying calm under pressure. His parents had raised him to keep his head down and work hard, but they'd also taught him to stand up for himself when it mattered. Tonight, it would matter. The trouble started when Mitch noticed Jamal. It wasn't just that Jamal was the only black kid in the diner. It was the way he carried himself, like he wasn't fazed by the world around him. Mitch leaned over to his friends, his voice loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Look at this guy sitting here like he's some kind of scholar. Bet he thinks he's better than us." His buddies laughed, egging him on. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, but no one said anything. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Linda, gave Mitch a wary glance but kept pouring coffee at the counter. Jamal heard the comment, but didn't react. He'd dealt with people like this before, guys who thought they could rattle him with a few cheap shots. He kept his eyes on his phone, taking a sip of his soda. But Mitch wasn't done. He raised his voice again, this time directing it straight at Jamal. "Hey, kid, what's with the books? You trying to act all smart or something?" Jake and Carl snickered, while Derek just watched, his expression unreadable. Jamal looked up, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. "I'm just eating, man. Not bothering anybody." His tone was steady, not confrontational, but there was an edge to it that suggested he wasn't going to be pushed around. Mitch didn't like that. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and sneered. "Oh, you got a mouth on you, huh? Maybe you should stick to your own kind of place. This ain't your spot." The words were laced with venom, and the diner went quiet. Linda froze behind the counter, her hand gripping the coffee pot. The truckers in the booth exchanged glances, but stayed silent. Everyone could feel the tension building. Jamal set his phone down and looked directly at Mitch. "My kind of place? I've been coming here since I was a kid. You're the one who just walked in." His voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it. He wasn't yelling or cursing, just stating facts. But to Mitch, it was a challenge. Jake piped up, leaning back in the booth with a grin. "Kid's got some guts, I'll give him that. But you better watch yourself, boy." The word boy hung in the air, deliberate and ugly. Carl laughed, slapping the table. But Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, like he wasn't entirely on board with where this was going. Jamal didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "You guys got a problem with me eating my fries? Because I'm not here to cause trouble. But if you keep pushing, you're gonna find out I'm not who you think I am." Mitch laughed, but it was a forced sound, like he was trying to cover up the fact that Jamal's confidence was throwing him off. Big talk for a kid. You think you're tough or something? He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and took a step toward Jamal's table. The other bikers stayed seated, but their eyes were locked on the scene, waiting to see what would happen. Linda finally stepped in, her voice firm but nervous. All right, that's enough. Everybody just calm down and eat your food. She looked at Mitch, then at Jamal, hoping to defuse the situation. But Mitch ignored her, his focus on Jamal. You heard her, Jamal said, his voice still steady. Go eat your food. I'm not your problem. He picked up a fry and took a bite, his eyes never leaving Mitch's. It was a small gesture, but it was like a slap in the face to Mitch, who wasn't used to being dismissed. Mitch took another step closer, looming over Jamal's table. You got some nerve, kid. You don't know who you're talking to. He leaned down, his face inches from Jamal's. Maybe we need to take this outside. That's when Jamal smiled. It wasn't a smug grin or a nervous twitch, just a calm, almost amused smile that made Mitch pause. Outside, Jamal said.
Nah, man.
I'm good right here. But if you want to talk, let's talk. You got something to say it. The diner was dead silent now. Every eye was on the two of them. Mitch's face reddened, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a teenager. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Jamal spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. You think you can scare me because you're bigger, louder, and got your buddies with you? I've dealt with guys like you my whole life. You're not special. Mitch's buddies shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with how this was playing out. Jake tried to laugh it off, saying, Kid's got a death wish, but it sounded hollow. Derek, the quiet one, was watching Jamal closely, like he was starting to see something the others didn't. Mitch straightened up, trying to regain control. You're gonna regret this, kid. You don't know what we're capable of. He jabbed a finger toward Jamal, his voice rising. We run this town. Jamal didn't blink. You don't run anything. You're just a guy with a loud mouth and a bad attitude. And if you keep pushing, you're gonna find out what I'm capable of. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, nobody moved. Linda looked like she was about to call the cops. The truckers were tense, their hands resting on the table like they were ready to step in. But Jamal just sat there, calm as ever, eating another fry. Mitch was fuming, but he could sense the room wasn't on his side. The other customers were watching, and even his buddies weren't jumping in to back him up like they usually would. He took a step back, muttering something about Jamal not being worth his time, and returned to his booth. His friends followed his lead, their laughter quieter now, less confident. But Jamal wasn't done. He knew guys like Mitch didn't back down that easily, and he wasn't about to let them think they'd won. He stood up, grabbed his backpack, and walked over to the counter to pay his bill. As he handed Linda some cash, he spoke loud enough for the bikers to hear. You know, Linda, it's a shame some people come into a nice place like this and try to ruin it for everybody else. But they always learn their lesson eventually. Linda gave him a small smile, clearly relieved the situation hadn't escalated further. You take care, Jamal, she said, handing him his change. He nodded and headed for the door, but not before glancing back at the biker's table. Mitch was glaring at him, but Jamal just gave him that same calm smile and walked out. The bikers thought that was the end of it. They were wrong. Outside, Jamal pulled out his phone and made a call. His older brother, Marcus, was a deputy sheriff in the next county over, and Jamal had learned a thing or two from him about dealing with troublemakers. Marcus had also introduced Jamal to a network of people who didn't take kindly to bullies, especially ones who threw around racial slurs like they were nothing. Jamal wasn't just a smart kid. He was connected, and he knew how to handle situations like this without throwing a punch. He called Marcus first, filling him in on what had happened. Marcus told him to stay calm and said he'd make a few calls of his own. Then Jamal texted a group chat with some friends from school, kids who, like him, had grown up dealing with people like Mitch and his crew. They weren't troublemakers, but they were resourceful, and they knew how to make a point. By the time the bikers left the diner an hour later, they were feeling smug, thinking they'd put that kid in his place. They climbed onto their motorcycles, revving the engines loudly as they prepared to ride off. But as they pulled out of the parking lot, they noticed something odd. A sheriff's patrol car was parked across the street, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Mitch didn't think much of it at first, but as they rode through town, the car followed at a distance. What the bikers didn't know was that Jamal's call to Marcus had set things in motion. Marcus had reached out to the local sheriff's department, where he had a few buddies. He didn't ask for anything dramatic, just a heads up about a group of bikers causing trouble at the diner. The sheriff's department already had a file on Mitch and his crew, who were known for stirring up trouble in neighboring towns. They'd been linked to a few bar fights and some low-level drug deals, but nothing solid enough to pin them down. Tonight, though, they'd given the authorities a reason to pay closer attention. As the bikers rode through town, they started to notice other things. A couple of guys in a pickup truck seemed to be tailing them, keeping just far enough back to avoid suspicion. When they stopped at a gas station, a group of teenagers, Jamal's friends, happened to be there, leaning against their cars and watching the bikers with knowing smiles. One of them, a kid named Trey, called out, "Nice bikes. Hope you're not planning on causing any more trouble tonight." Mitch bristled, but before he could respond, the sheriff's car pulled into the gas station. A deputy stepped out, a guy named Officer Reynolds, who knew Marcus and had gotten the call about the diner. He didn't approach the bikers directly, but made a point of walking over to Trey and his friends, chatting with them like they were old buddies. The message was clear. The bikers were being watched. Mitch and his crew decided to get out of town. They didn't like the way things were feeling, and they figured they'd head to a bar a few miles down the highway. But when they got there, they found the parking lot unusually busy. A group of locals, some of whom Jamal had tipped off through his network, were already there, and they didn't look happy to see the bikers. One of them, a burly mechanic named Dave, stepped forward as Mitch and his crew walked in. "You the guys who are hassling a kid at the diner?" Dave asked, his voice calm but firm. Mitch tried to laugh it off, but Dave wasn't smiling. "We don't take kindly to that around here. Especially when you're throwing around the kind of garbage you were saying." The bar got quiet. Mitch's buddies shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were outnumbered. Derek, the quiet one, finally spoke up. "Look, man, we don't want trouble. We're just here for a drink." But Dave shook his head. "You already caused trouble. Maybe you should find somewhere else to drink." The bikers didn't have much choice. The bar's owner, who'd been tipped off by one of Jamal's friends, made it clear they weren't welcome. They left, their egos bruised, and headed back to their bikes. But when they got there, they found another surprise. One of the bikes had a flat tire. It wasn't vandalism, nobody could prove anything, but it was enough to make them paranoid. By now, Mitch was furious, but he was also starting to realize something. This wasn't random. That kid from the diner had something to do with it. He didn't know how, but he could feel it. What he didn't know was that Jamal's network wasn't just a few friends. It was a tight-knit community of people who looked out for each other. Jamal had grown up in this town, and while he was just a teenager, he'd earned the respect of a lot of people. His debate team coach was the mayor's brother. His mom worked at the local community center, where half the town's kids hung out. His dad was a retired firefighter who still had pull with the local first responders. And Marcus, his brother, wasn't just a deputy. He was someone who knew how to rally people when it mattered. Over the next few days, the bikers couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Everywhere they went, someone seemed to know who they were and what they'd done at the diner. When they tried to eat at another restaurant in town, the service was slow and the staff was cold. When they stopped at a different gas station, the clerk accidentally overcharged them and took his time fixing it. Even their usual hangouts started feeling unwelcoming as word spread about how they'd treated Jamal. It wasn't just social pressure, though. The sheriff's department had started digging into Mitch and his crew. That night at the diner had given them a reason to pull records, and it turned out Jake had an outstanding warrant for a DUI from a year ago. By the end of the week, he was picked up during a routine traffic stop. Carl, it turned out, had been sloppy about some of his side hustles, and a tip to the authorities, nobody could say where it came from, led to a search of his bike, where they found enough to charge him with possession. Mitch was starting to unravel. He couldn't prove it, but he was convinced that kid from the diner was behind it all. He thought about confronting Jamal again, but every time he considered it, he remembered the way Jamal had looked at him, calm, confident, like he knew something Mitch didn't. And then there was the fact that everywhere Mitch went, someone seemed to be watching. He started to feel like he was losing control. Derek, the quiet one, was the first to break. He pulled Mitch aside one night and said, "Man, we messed with the wrong kid. That guy's got this whole town behind him. We need to get out of here before things get worse." Mitch didn't want to hear it, but even he couldn't ignore the truth. Their little stunt at the diner had backfired in a way they never could have predicted. A week later, Mitch and Derek packed up and left town. Jake was in jail, and Carl was dealing with his own legal mess. The biker crew that had rolled into the diner so confidently was now a shadow of itself, their reputation in tatters. Word had spread not just in town but to neighboring counties, and wherever they went, they found doors closing in their faces. Jamal, meanwhile, went back to his routine. He didn't brag about what had happened or gloat about the bikers' downfall. He didn't need to. He'd handled the situation his way, smart, strategic, and without ever raising his voice. His friends knew what he'd done, and so did the people who mattered. Linda at the diner gave him free pie the next time he came in, and Officer Reynolds stopped by to tell him he'd done the right thing by keeping his cool. The bikers had thought they could intimidate a kid and walk away unscathed. They didn't realize that Jamal was more than just a teenager with a backpack and a plate of fries. He was someone who knew how to stand his ground, not with fists but with something far more powerful, the respect and loyalty of a community that had his back. And that was a lesson Mitch and his crew would never forget.